God, YouTube was a mistake. What's up, YouTube? It's Boondock here, and this is my third time filming this video because what's good audio? I don't know. Anyway, I recently did a video on 40 Smith & Wesson, and probably one of the most common comments I got was how 357 was better. You're rechambering, rebarreling your 40s for 357. It's gonna overthrow 40 Smith & Wesson somehow. I think the second most common comment I got was how 40 was outdated, move on to a modern caliber, and I don't think either of these videos are really for you people if that's the case. Make sure you like, comment, subscribe, and let's get started on comparing whether 357 really is better than 40. Interestingly enough, I think when most people picture something overthrowing something else on the market, we probably imagine it being something new. But 357 Magnum was in fact invented in 1935 and stemmed from the Prohibition era. Much like 40 Smith & Wesson, where the police forces kind of wanted more bang for their buck, they needed something with a little bit better penetration capabilities. The police units at this time were dealing with heightened crime rates due to gangs and prohibition and smuggling alcohol and all of that, and felt the need to have better penetration capabilities with their rounds. Now, to be fair, the common police caliber at this time was 32 or 38, so I can 100% see why they might have wanted something with a bit better velocity, muzzle energy, so on and so forth. For those of you who might not know, 32 hits about 800 feet per second. On a good day, I am being generous, and probably about 150 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. 38 is obviously a little bit better, and that's going to run you closer towards 1,000 feet per second, probably more likely like 950, 940, with a notable increase in muzzle energy of 300 to 400 foot-pounds. Obviously, 357 Magnum is going to be substantially better than either of those two, running you about 1,450 feet per second, and 500, probably much closer to 600 foot-pounds of muzzle energy. So they definitely did make an improvement, had way better penetration capabilities. For all three of these rounds, your temporary cavity is a non-concern, so it really did become a conversation of how much better you could penetrate and how much larger the primary cavity would have been for any three of them. Of course, 357 Magnum being the better of the bunch. At this time, of course, revolvers were the go-to, but as semi-auto pistols made their way to the market and became the popular thing to use, 357 Magnum very quickly fell off, and understandably so. Cue a few paradigm shifts where we moved through 9mm, 40 Smith & Wesson, back to 9, and somehow 40 Smith & Wesson, 357, these types of calibers are definitely making a resurgence in popularity. If you guys haven't caught on, I think all trends wind up being cyclic, whether it be firearms, ammunition, fashion, video game style trends, so on and so forth. We certainly loop back around to what we consider fashionable and popular, and not that I think 40 Smith & Wesson or 357 will by any means become the big thing in the market, the go-to for people to use. Within those niche communities, or those people who might be more classic caliber, classic firearm focused, you will see these kind of ebb and flow in popularity. With that said, in the case of these two calibers, I do think it largely comes down to a conversation of firearm preference. We'll get a little bit more into this, but at the end of the day, 357 and 40 Smith & Wesson do wind up giving very similar performance specs. So I think the driving factor is going to be if you have a preferred weapon for the two, or maybe if you're looking for like revolver over a semi-auto pistol, so on and so forth. But let's get into a little more detail on those specifications and the differences you might see between the two. At the end of the day, if you really wanted to, via changing charge weights, grains of your projectile, barrel lengths of your firearms, you can make 357 and 40 Smith & Wesson have very comparable performance, negligible differences between the two. But I think a good general rule of thumb is that 357 Magnum will be better at throwing heavier bullets at faster speeds. A lot of you guys think velocity is king, so right off the bat, this sounds like 357 will be the better cartridge type between the two. I said this in the 40 video, I will say it here. I think for both of these guns, recoil winds up being subjective to the specific firearm you are using, though 357 is generally considered to have a little bit snappier recoil than 40 Smith & Wesson. I find it wildly unfair to compare revolvers and semi-auto pistols just by inherent design of the guns, how your grip might adjust, how the slide moves and affects recoil while you fire. So that's not an apples to apples, but 357 SIG does exist and it is intended to be used. 357 SIG does exist, and the intent for that is, of course, semi-auto pistols, which will give a better one-to-one comparison. And again, generally, that is considered to be snappier than 40 within the same type of platform. Now, 357 SIG and Magnum are certainly not identical. We're talking rimless and bottlenecked. 357 Mag does typically offer heavier grain choices between 357 SIG. 357 SIG, however, does often have higher velocities. If we go with lighter grains, that makes sense, but you might see higher velocities at the expense of slightly lower muzzle energy. But at the end of the day, I do think these two are a pretty good one-to-one comparison between the gun types. Can't interchange those calibers between weapon types, but in general, their performance and their outputs are going to be extremely similar from one another. If you don't like shooting 40 Smith & Wesson though, you probably won't enjoy shooting 357. That's just the nature of the game between the two. And while velocity is not king, it certainly will help for penetration. Projectile design matters. A whole bunch of other factors play a role. But for both of these rounds, I think over-penetration does wind up becoming a concern. And if that's something you are worried about, then 40 Smith & Wesson might get a little extra bonus points. It's taking a heavier round and throwing it at a slower velocity, meaning it's a little bit less likely to over-penetrate than 357 Magnum might be. Not that it's still not a concern for either of them, not that penetration depths between the two can't be comparable, but 40 Smith & Wesson does get a little extra bonus points in regards to that being less of a concern. A slower, heavier round, of course, is going to be less likely to just zip straight through. So we circle back to my first main point. I really do think it comes down to a conversation of whatever firearm type you might prefer. 40 Smith & Wesson is generally going to have a higher mag capacity because, well, you're shooting a semi-auto pistol and those mags really better hold more than 6 rounds as opposed to the revolver. If we're talking about self-defense carry, then more rounds does sound more better, right? We all like to have an extra chance at being able to complete our task successfully. And if that means more rounds on our person, then so be it. We don't want to risk those types of situations. However, there are a lot of you watching this video that absolutely will ride or die by revolvers. That's what you carry every day to begin with. So 357 winds up becoming a no-brainer. And it certainly does help that if your gun is chambered in 357, you can shoot 38 special, and it's going to be significantly cheaper. Absolutely zero recoil to shoot, making it a lot more enjoyable for just fun range days, you know? If we're just plinking for the sake of plinking, having that interchangeability between the two caliber types makes it a lot more affordable and a lot more enjoyable. To you guys who had something chambered in 40 Smith & Wesson, it is very easy to convert over. Simple barrel swap. Your springs probably don't have to be changed out, making it super viable to do. And now you have a gun that is able to be shot in multiple calibers, probably saving you some money because quite frankly, all of these are expensive. So I definitely understand the appeal at that point in transitioning to something like 357 Magnum. For me, at least, in terms of an everyday carry, I don't think either of those are viable. Sure, you can out-train them, you can get better, but the reality is I'm tiny. They're usually larger firearms. Revolver triggers, even the best of them are still revolver triggers. So for me, at least, as an everyday carry, neither is going to happen. But that's not to say that I don't appreciate either of these rounds in terms of capabilities, in terms of history, and quite frankly, revolvers look cool. I actually appreciate them as much as I generally dislike shooting them. Some of them are way better than others, especially once you start adding on some length and weight. I had a Ruger and a Colt over here. The Colt had a little bit longer of a barrel, definitely a lot more weight to the front, and shooting 357 through that was significantly more enjoyable. But they're nice looking pieces, so if nothing else, it's a collector's item. And then at that point, both calibers are totally cool to use. It's not something I'm taking to the range every day to begin with. So the short and sweet, I don't think you can go wrong with either, especially if your heart is already connected to a certain type of gun to fit. That's all I had for you guys. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully this audio is okay this time around. If not, I might cry a little bit. Hope to see you all next time. Bye. Hi, you're not supposed to be on camera. Yes, I know. Neither of you, yeah.